are live. Hello, Father. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, no, thanks for the invitation. It's good to see you.
Absolutely. Yeah, you too. Yeah, even though we're 300 miles apart, but it's still good.
Close by Montana standards.
Yeah, right. Oh, man. Yeah, you can make it within a day, so it's good.
Yeah.
All right. So in your own words, would you care to give us a little introduction and background on yourself real quick?
Yeah, certainly. So my name is Father Eric Gilbaugh, and I was once Laura's pastor and that of her husband, too. He grew up down here in the Gallatin Valley, where I'm pastor of St. John Vianney Parish in Belgrade, Montana, and Holy Family Parish in Three Forks. So Laura and AJ have moved up north some years back, but very happy. I didn't know that she had this channel, so at her kind invitation, I'm with her and with you, and I guess probably the only really general biographical thing that you could know about me is that I'm a lifelong Catholic. I came from Oregon to Montana to attend Carroll College, discerned my vocation here, was sent to seminary by Bishop Robert Morlino, and I've been a priest for 17 years. So how's that? Is that enough?
That's great. No, awesome. Yeah, I can't believe it's been that long. Like, I mean, I can, but at the same time, I was like, really? I was doing the
math. I recently was a guest at the Silver Jubilee celebration for Father Dougald McCallum, priest of our diocese. And I remember when he, the year he was ordained. So here I was sitting there, and it occurred to me, I'm only a few years behind. And the thought that you would have a 25th, anniversary of your priesthood seems like something for, a much older priest. But, oh, well.
Oh, my gosh.
So I'm 45 years old now. So getting there. That's life.
That's okay.
How many years have you been married?
6.5 so far. So, yeah. I know.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would think.
Sound like that long, but,
I would have thought that it would have been like 9, honestly.
Really? Ooh,
yeah,
I must be looking older.
Well, no, the way time flies, because I've been in this assignment now for 14 and a half years.
Wow.
So
they must like you there. They must think you're doing a good thing when you really have. I mean, that mission, it was a mission in Belgrade. And then when you got there, how long before it became a parish then? It really grew.
5 years. Yeah.
Okay.
But that wasn't because of me. It was already that way when I got here. It just needed to officially change.
All right. Okay.
Anyway.
Oh, we'll go with that. Okay, thanks, Father.
Let's go with that.
Awesome. All right. Well, we're here to talk about the Roman liturgy, and I will be following the outlines so that I don't lose any of my points, and you can stay on track. Awesome. So the first question I have for you is that you've spent a significant amount of time researching liturgical history and the proper celebration of the Mass since becoming a priest. So do you consider that your seminary formation gave you a good grounding in those areas, or are you mostly self-educated?
Well, I would say that my seminary formation gave me a real solid foundation, but I wouldn't say that the academic formation was outstanding, and that wasn't because of the seminary or they had a change in faculty while I was there, and somebody had to teach our Roman liturgy class, and I don't know that he was necessarily well prepared for it. But more importantly, I would say that my formation there was very, very excellent in practice. So Archbishop Charles Chaput was the archbishop at the time, very, very serious about liturgical discipline, fidelity, reverence to the Blessed Sacrament, and so forth. And the priests that he installed in the seminary, which, by the way, was the first seminary to open in many decades in the United States, he had a clean slate. He only had priests who would offer the Mass reverently and well. So we were, we were always in cassock and surplice in the chapel. We had exposition of the Blessed Sacrament every day. We were taught to chant and do our parts of the Mass in not just English, but also Latin. We had to study Latin along with also Greek and Hebrew. And so the foundation was there. And then after I was ordained, then I also began a self-study on my own. And I'm no expert, but we all have our interests, and liturgy has been one of mine. Because growing up in Portland, Oregon, in a parish there that was uh, fairly liberal leaning. I, I I experienced the worst of liturgy, I would say,
Mm.
uh, and then I wanted to know why was it that we've seen these pendulum swings between what my parents grew up with, or my dad grew up with in the same parish, and what I grew up with. Um, not too many years after the close of the Second Vatican Council, and then where the church was trying to go, and it's been a curiosity of mine. And so
Right. Yeah.
now
There
that
is.
I'm a priest too, um, I'm the one who has to actualize liturgy. And so that means that if I do something poorly, you know, people will point it out to me or make decisions based upon that. Or
Oh,
if I make changes, as I understand the church wanting me to make them, then I'll, have people say, why are you doing this? Or I'm leaving the parish because you're doing this, or, whatever. So,
ay, ay, ay.
yeah. So a lot of people these days who are interested in liturgy are laypersons,
Mm-hmm.
but and probably a minority of us are clergy. What I can bring to the conversation is the perspective of a priest
Yeah.
who has boots on the ground and has to balance an awful lot of different realities and priorities.
Right. No, I think that's such an invaluable perspective because, like you say, I mean, I would say I've run into many priests that are interested in liturgy and reverence in the Mass, but more lay people that are, like concerned about it and they kind of watch and they're like, and they judge very easily. I mean, it's just so easy to judge someone in authority because you're like, it looks so simple. Why can't you just do this or that? And
Mhm.
yeah, it's just, we need a reality check because we don't know what it's like and all the things that you guys have to deal with. So that'll be just awesome to have.
Well, I'll tell you, if it was as simple as just snapping my fingers and having, a choir of 20 that sang at every mass perfectly, and an organist, uh, I just snap my fingers,
Yeah.
as a for example. But we have to work with who we have. We have to work with what we have and where we are and so on. I can't just manufacture a Baroque church if
Yeah.
I don't have one, so.
Yeah. Right. That's a good
And
point.
also I have limited authority. I'm a priest, I'm not a bishop. So somebody might say,
Mhm.
uh, you know, do this, and my bishop might have said, I forbid you from doing that.
Yeah.
So who knows?
I mean, there's even things you can't tell people when they ask.
Right.
So you're like, oh, how do I answer this without, giving away information that's not really for you? So
Right. I was put in a very, very difficult situation once when I had done a catechetical series within the parish, uh, and I said, here are some elements that are of interest to people, but perhaps the context or the understanding isn't there. So here it is, and then understandably there was the expectation. Well, okay, then let's do that. But
yeah,
then after the fact, my bishop explicitly forbade those things. Now, so then the question was I going to get into a civil war with my bishop, with my spiritual father, to whom I've pledged obedience?
yeah,
And the answer was no. So people were saying, well, we don't understand if this is the ideal of the church, why aren't you doing it? But I couldn't throw my bishop under the bus by saying, well, because uh,
right.
he doesn't want it. So yeah, it's
Oh
just the
boy.
reality of life.
Well, and that don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It's good to
Mhm.
know the ideal we should all know. And it's great that you're willing to
Right.
educate everyone because it empowers people. Then they're equipped to know how they can go and help and what to look for, what to, promote. But yeah, it's like within what you can actually do. It's not.
And with the passage of some time and some circumstances, we did make some changes, but
Mhm.
just not immediately. And I think a lot of people they really love immediacy, and uh, it takes some patience and humility to just say, you know, Rome wasn't built in a day, and the Roman Rite will probably not be reformed in a day either. So
It's a good point. Awesome. All right. Well, I mean, I feel like you kind of covered this, but I'm sure you have more to say on this question about what makes you so passionate about the Mass and the proper celebration of it.
Well, it is the most important thing that exists, the Eucharist. And the Second Vatican Council hyperbolically described it as the source and summit of the whole Christian life, which is a remarkable statement and betrays an extraordinarily high Eucharistic theology, which of course I subscribe to. So the liturgy, unfortunately, usually is the place in which divisions, differences, ideologies are exposed.
Mm-hmm.
It has almost become an ideological battleground in the church today, but it's not supposed to be. It's supposed to be the source of our unity and also the outward manifestation of our unity.
Mm-hmm.
So it is supposed to be the source of communion.
Mm-hmm.
And if, on the other hand, it is actually the source of division, then there's something very wrong there.
Yeah.
So my goal has been to understand what the church's ideal is and then attempt to implement that to the greatest degree that I'm able.
Mm-hmm.
And by having understanding, be able to hopefully bridge ideological divides, generational divides, and so on. So
that's awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
All right. So kind of getting into a section of questions about like debunking myths surrounding the Mass of Pius V and myths about Vatican II. My first question is that the Mass of 1962 Missal is often called the traditional Latin Mass or Mass of the Ages. And would you say those are accurate terms?
Well, I would say that they are problematic terms. Let's go back to 1962. One would not have encountered terms such as the Mass of Pius V, the Tridentine Mass, the traditional Latin Mass, the Mass of the Ages, or any such thing. Nobody would know what you were talking about. There was only the Mass.
Mm-hmm.
And these terms have been invented only since the 1970s to distinguish the form of the Roman Rite as it existed before the Council as opposed to the form after the Council. So that form then has also been described as the Mass of Pope Paul VI, the Mass of Vatican II, the Novus Ordo, and then Pope Benedict XVI in 2007, when he allowed a more liberal use of the older forms of the sacramental rites, then introduced two more terms.
Oh, yeah.
The ordinary form and the extraordinary form.
Which are kind of confusing terms.
Right. So, and an admittedly confusing liturgical theology, but that's a different matter. I had heard, but I haven't been able to find it. I had heard that Pope Francis wanted the older form of the rite to be referred to as no longer the extraordinary form, but as the TLM, or traditional Latin Mass. So I haven't been able to find that, but somebody had said that to me. Okay, well, words are powerful and they have meaning, and I've never liked the term traditional Latin Mass because it implies that since it is a term only used to contrast with something else, that it is traditional to be contrasted with something that's not traditional. Moreover, it defines the liturgy principally by a language, since of course the Mass after the Council was done almost entirely in vernacular languages, which I think was not correct, but nevertheless, in fact, And so you have, what's the dominant takeaway from the older form of the Mass? The language, the fact that it was in Latin. But an example that I have given is this. Let's say that you have today a young Catholic, and he approaches the priest. And he might say, Father, could we have a traditional Latin Mass sometime? Okay. Well, let's go back 50 years in history. And there is a young Catholic approaching the priest, and he says, Father, could we have a guitar folk Mass sometime? Okay. Well, defining the Mass either by an instrument, a guitar, or by the language that the prayers are offered in, Latin, minimalizes what the Mass is. Reducing it to a guitar or a language, I think, is very inappropriate. So I don't care for the term traditional Latin Mass. I don't like the term Latin Mass even, TLM. I don't know precisely how to refer to it, so I usually say the older form of the Rite, or the preconciliar form of the Rite. But I would like to, be in step with what we are supposed to be saying now, if it's no longer extraordinary and ordinary forms. There is a book which I'd like to mention at the end of our conversation here for your viewership, and the author makes this point that the form of the Roman Rite as it exists now, if offered correctly and well, is actually more traditional than the form of the Rite that existed before the council and had for quite a number of years, as codified by Pope Pius V. And that, to me, is probably the most challenging assertion that can be made to a person who says, well, I prefer that which is more traditional. I would respond, oh, okay, so you prefer the Mass after the Second Vatican Council? Oh, no, absolutely not. Well, so that betrays an ignorance, quite frankly, of history and the way that the Mass has changed, developed, been modified, added to, subtracted to, and so on. Just to put it very bluntly, the liturgy of the Mass's institution, the Eucharistic liturgy institution, was the Passover of Jesus Christ, which was very, very different, though also very essentially similar to the Mass as we know it, right?
Yeah.
But, they didn't profess the Creed of Nicaea. They didn't sing the Gloria. There was no Latin. Nobody was wearing a maniple, and so on. So how do we get from that to the Mass of the Middle Ages, Trent, to what we have today? It's very complicated, actually, history.
Right. Well, that's another question: is what have history and archaeology shown us in recent centuries that proves the Mass had changed a lot since its institution? Because archaeology is a relatively new thing, right? I mean, even that. So
yes, almost all of the academic disciplines that we take for granted today or familiar to us today are relatively new. So in a conversation podcast that I was recently on, I made this point that if you go back just 200 years and you were to survey the different departments or disciplines within a European or American university, they would be quite limited. So many things have developed in the natural sciences and the humanities and so on. You named one. Archaeology didn't really exist. It developed in the 1800s as an academic and professional discipline. Liturgical theology was not a studied field of theology, more or less before the early 20th century, into the 1800s too, and so on. So what had happened, and this is being simplistic, but I think also accurate, we had the Western liturgy more or less codified after Trent as the Roman Rite, and not much changed then. until people began to study liturgy as a discipline, go back into the patristic texts, or discover ancient manuscripts, then publish them, translate them. People then could read them for the first time. Mm-hmm. You know, they might have always existed, for example, on a shelf in some obscure library, physically existed, but weren't being studied and disseminated, or and so on. Mm-hmm. And churches, floor plans being excavated, studied, and so forth. Even in the city of Rome, it became popular to excavate under the high altar of some of the oldest churches to see what was down there. And if you go to Rome today, you'll usually see staircases that take you down below the altar, and then there will be the more ancient church upon which the usually Baroque church was built. So people began to just ask questions. Why did this change between this era and that? Who changed it? By what authority? Was it secular interference? Was it papal mandate? Was it an accident? And so forth. And so what you had by the turn of the 20th century was data, a body of data that then could either, you could do something with that data, for example, to reform the Eucharistic liturgy or not. And Pope Pius V began certain liturgical reforms that really then began what was known as the liturgical movement of the 20th century. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So the Second Vatican Council did not occur out of a vacuum. The Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy did not occur out of a vacuum. There were decades of buildup, and popes who were leading this, but there was no council during the 20th century until 1962. But there were 2 world wars, and very distracting to different efforts of the church and so on. But I did dig up a couple of texts, actually, just to illustrate this point, if you'd like me to just give you a couple of citations. Okay. The Second Vatican Council emphasized that the conscious and active participation of the faithful was the principle to be considered above all else in the reform of the liturgy. And people argue about that English translation, but let's just say conscientious. So you're conscious, you're conscientious of what you're doing. You're engaged and you're active rather than passive. And people will say, well, this is more or less a liberal or a modernist principle that is imposed on the church in this council, and that is not the case whatsoever. This is 1947, Pius XII, Mediator Dei, in which in section 78 he references active and individual participation, which was a development of a term actually going back to Pius V that had been repeated by other popes. But I want to read this paragraph from this is paragraph 80, mind you, 1947. Okay, all the faithful should be aware that to participate in the Eucharistic sacrifice is their chief duty and supreme dignity. Okay, to participate. Now, what kind of participation does he mean? Does he mean going to Mass on Sunday as opposed to not? Or what does he mean? He continues, he says, and that not in an inert and negligent fashion, giving way to distractions and daydreaming, but with such earnestness and concentration that they may be united as closely as possible with the high priest, according to the apostle, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Now, if I was to, say the people, the faithful at the Eucharistic liturgy should not be there in an inert, negligent fashion, giving way to distractions, daydreaming, and so on. The person, you probably wouldn't think of Pius XII as characterizing a passive participation in that way. I mean, it's a little bit edgy. But of course, the church had been wanting for quite a long time for the faithful to reclaim their participation in first the chants and then just the prayers in general, the responses,
Mm-hmm.
whereas they were done for them by the altar boy, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so a bit of an unknown fact is that in 19 and by the way, this is a difficult thing to do, as I have learned as a priest. If people are not used to something, then to get everybody trained and on the same page, it's very difficult, takes time. And so this was given as a mandate to the church, but was slow to be implemented or regular. That another pope in the 20th century would say, "We remind you, the people are to chant their responses, priests are to teach the people to." Okay, but didn't happen. 1958. This is before the council. This is the instruction on sacred music and sacred liturgy. It says, the congregation can sing the parts of the ordinary of the Mass, but if they are unable to sing all these parts, there is no reason why they cannot sing the easier ones. Kyrie, Sanctus, Benedictus, Agnus Dei. The choir then can sing the Gloria and Credo. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Every effort must be made that the faithful of the entire world learn to sing these responses. And then also, quote, it is desirable that on Sundays and feast days, the parish or principal Mass be a sung Mass.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a tall order. So let's
Yeah.
go back to 1958 and let's wander throughout the Roman Rite, throughout the whole world. Not go peeking into Sunday Masses. Are they sung Masses? No, they're silent Masses by and large. Why?
Yeah.
Because that's easier. And often there's multiple Masses stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
Um, and do the people do their responses? Uh, to a large degree, no. Okay.
Yeah.
What I found today amongst traditionalists is really a desire for a silent liturgy that allows them to meditate without being distracted by this active and conscientious participation, which I just wish to point out is contrary to a 1958 instruction, not a 1978 instruction. Okay.
Yeah. Right.
So I find
Mm.
there to be a bit of arbitrariness in people's preferences right now liturgically, as
Yeah.
opposed to desiring to do what the church desires us to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It usually does reflect some like ignorance of liturgical history, because it's like they've encountered some traditional community or the older rite of Mass, and then they're like, well, however it is, if it's a low Mass and it's spoken, or sometimes high and sung, and they're like, oh, that was awesome, but they're not expecting that all the time, and then they kind of get this in their head, like, well, this is what always was, and so this is what we
Right.
want, and this is how it should be, or the way people do it now, like it's been preserved fully up to this point, at least in that form. And that's not true. I mean, I can't cite the reference now, but I could find it and put it in the description below. But I know that even the altar boys saying the responses exclusively for the congregation was actually basically an abuse that developed over time, because the congregation was always meant to say at least some of those responses. And then it just happened that they thought, they kind of just passed it off to the altar boy, or it was sort of discouraged that the faithful be responding. And so now if you go to a 1962 missal Mass, it's very common that people will like look at you funny if you say some of those responses, as if you're
Yeah.
doing something wrong. And it's like, hey, this is my part. They're
That
representing me, but I'm here and I have rights.
that happened to me once, actually, when I was at a low Mass, and I was not able to concelebrate because concelebration
Yeah.
didn't exist. So
Right.
I just was one of the worshipers, and I assumed that the priest would want me or us to, say our responses as per the church's directives,
Yeah.
1958 directives.
Yeah.
But he was annoyed, and I was the only one. It was awkward. I was like, well, are we not supposed to say these things? So, Yeah, there's it's a jungle out there
Yeah.
anyway.
The best participation I've ever seen in the responses was at my sister's wedding, which was almost entirely Novus Ordo, like people attending, but she had a 1962 missal mass for the wedding, and we'd print up these booklets with like, your part is in bold. And everybody was like following along like good little good little Catholics, and they're like saying everything with such gusto. I was like, wow, I'm really impressed.
And that's because they have lived during this post-conciliar age in which the participation of the faithful has been so emphasized. Many of them don't know any differently. And I'll also note that we had the privilege of the incorrupt heart of St. John Vianney here at St. John Vianney Parish, where I am. Did you come down for that, by the way? Okay, I'm sorry. Well, so we had a magnificent mass. The place was packed. I think we had maybe 9 priests celebrating and a deacon, and it was the most fulsome liturgy I think ever celebrated in this church building. And the people I have trained to know their parts in Latin, to chant them, to chant well, and so on. And when we began the Gloria in Latin, I remember thinking to myself, I'm about to be blown through the back wall of the church because there are 300 people behind me singing with full voice the Gloria in Latin. It was stupendous. It was far better, if I may say so, than any trained choir. And it's magnificent. If you can reach that point at which people have ownership of the participation principle and they feel comfortable chanting together or singing together, they know their parts and how to pronounce them, it's magnificent.
So. Oh, that's awesome. No, it's something I found that in our society, we really have this idea of like musical consumerism. Like you listen to it, you take it in, but you don't necessarily participate in music. And, if people are really shy of, well, I don't have a good voice or whatever, it's like they bring that to mass and then they just kind of sit there awkwardly. But it doesn't, like with the priest especially, it doesn't matter if he has a good voice or not, because whatever he sings, you can just feel the congregation want to respond to him. I mean, I can when I'm in the pews. And if the priest isn't chanting and it's just a cantor or somebody who's singing, I mean, it's just a lot weaker. It's like, oh, yeah, I guess we're supposed to do this. But when the priest is leading, they don't care how he sounds like. They just want to be led and they want to respond to his fatherhood. And so that, again, in the congregation, it's like, sing. Don't worry if you don't get it perfectly or, you're not polished. It's like God wants to hear your voice, not just some recording of perfection.
And it's nice when there's there are cultures from parish to parish, church to church. And if you have a singing culture, that's going to be great, because then the person who doesn't maybe naturally sing or is inclined to sing, they're going to feel comfortable blending in. But on the other hand, if you don't have that culture, it's really hard to, get going and so on, as with, many different things.
So. Right. Oh, we could have a whole episode on sacred music. Maybe I'll have you back.
We certainly could, yeah. But I don't think I'd bring much to the fore. That's really your forte.
Yeah, I think you would.
Sacred music.
Anyway. So. All right. Okay. So, so some practices that Catholics today assume to be traditional then are not as longstanding as we thought. Like, could you give us some examples of that?
Aspects of the TLM, if you will, that are assumed to be very traditional, but not so much?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, let's see. If we want to go back, if we want to go way back, I would point out just Latin. So the traditional Latin Mass, the Eucharistic liturgy was not originally celebrated in Latin at all. It was celebrated in Greek. That was the apostolic tradition. So to be provocative, when the church mandated that the Western Eucharistic liturgy, what we call the Mass, be celebrated in Latin, that was a rupture, a break with apostolic tradition.
Ooh.
Yeah. So let's say that we go back to around the year 400, and I can't remember exactly what the year was that this decree was made. But what had happened was, Greek being kind of the English of the Mediterranean world at the time of the apostles, in the Western Empire, it had transitioned more and more to Latin being the vernacular. So if you were to go back and let's say that you took the mindset of wanting to be traditional, and you went to the city of Rome, the Mass had always been celebrated in Greek, going back to the apostles. And now a pope says, we're going to take the language of the street, the vulgar language, which is where the word vulgate for the Bible comes from, right? The common language, Latin.
Yeah.
We're going to take this pagan language that we now speak, and we're going to stop with the Greek and the Eucharistic liturgy, and I'm going to impose the Latin. An ancient traditionalist would be outraged
No.
that this disgusting, vulgar, pagan language was now supplanting this Greek. The whole New Testament was written in Greek, as inspired by the Holy Spirit. The apostles celebrated the liturgy in Greek, and now we're going to Latin? And the answer is yes. So then now fast forward, people are disgusted that the Mass is celebrated in the vernacular. We need to go back to Latin. We need to define the Mass by its language, the traditional Latin Mass. Well, you can see when you consider the context here, Latin was mandated as the liturgy, liturgical language, because it was a vernacular, not because it's apostolic. And then the Romance languages develop, and there's traumas in the West, and Latin fades into the background or becomes Spanish and Italian and French and so on. And we forget why Latin was a liturgical language. It was so that people could understand. The church's rationale was people used to understand Greek, that's why it was in Greek, and now they understand Latin, not Greek, so we need to go to Latin. But Latin served a good purpose. It united Christians in a multilingual West in their worship, but also eventually restricted people's ability to precisely understand the prayers of the Mass. I mean, of course, you knew generally what could be going on, but not in any sort of specific way.
Right.
So that would be one. Great. Latin would be one. What would be some others? How about vestments?
Oh, yeah.
When people celebrate the older form of the Roman Rite today, what vestment will they often, what form of a chasuble will they often be wearing?
Oh, those Roman little...
Right, the Roman-style chasuble, also called a fiddleback, which is the absolute most cut-down, minimalist version of a ceremonial robe that you can get. Almost a bib. And
oh no.
The chasuble is intended to be a ceremonial robe that would appear somewhat like that which Jesus would have worn in the institution of the Eucharist, right?
Okay.
And in the East, their chasubles are very, very full. Through the Middle Ages, also in the West, let's say that you look at the tomb, the carved tomb of a pope, and he's represented there as laying down, with his mitre or tiara on, and he's vested. His vestment will be much more fulsome. Well, the Roman Rite chasuble was almost, as far as I'm aware, a fad from the city of Rome. That then, as depicted in art, you see a lot of Roman associated saints, Ignatius Loyola, Philip Neri, and so on, wearing it, and you think, oh, this is great. Well, it is great if it's a hot climate because there's hardly anything to it.
Yeah.
But does it, if you were to go back, not even a very few centuries, and show up for Mass as a priest wearing that, everybody would look at you like, what? What in the world is that? You forgot to get
dressed.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Chant. You asked about elements. that you might think of as very traditional. Chant is very traditional, but chant was re-emphasized as a common practice only in the early 20th century by Pope Pius the 10th. Yeah. Supplanting basically choral masses.
Yeah.
Mozart wasn't writing chant; he was
Yeah.
writing, great choral masses, and more or less, whether you like it or not, Pius V's mandate that everybody needs to chant brought an end to that direction in sacred music within the church.
Did
The
you mean
organ.
Pius X? You said Pius V. I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry, Pius the 10th.
Pius
Thank
X.
you.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay. Okay, good.
the organ. Uh, Somebody once told me that the Orthodox make fun of us Catholics because we took an instrument from carnivals and and introduced it into Eucharistic liturgy. Again, taking something vulgar and putting it into the Eucharistic liturgy,
That's what
could
we're
be
good at.
could be offensive. Yeah. I love the organ. I play the organ. Don't get me wrong. I'm just pointing out, you step back from our context and familiarity. How did the organ get in there?
Yeah.
You know, um, the communion rail
Oh,
is
that's a good one.
really just it is a co-Protestant / Catholic um, liturgical innovation from the 16th century.
Wow.
Very, very curious that, again, if you're stepping outside of the context, Protestant churches had communion rails, Roman Rite Catholic churches had communion rails, unknown in the East, and also unknown in the West before the 16th century. Yeah.
Wow. That is so
Yeah.
fun. That blew my mind. But I heard you mention that on that podcast you did with Catholic Stuff You Should Know. And I just
Mhm.
thought, holy cow, never heard that before. Because, yeah, you think, oh, yeah, you just kind of stop thinking because you're like, oh, yeah, this is good. This is old. So it's worth keeping. And you just don't really bother to go, how far back does this really go? And then what
Yeah.
constitutes like, who's judging old, traditional, etc. It's like really, honestly, most of the time when it comes down to it, it's private individuals. They're just looking at something and kind of making like a slapdash guess at it. I mean, it
Yeah.
sounds
As
kind of
far
bad,
as
but
as far as I know, the Jesu in Rome, the headquarters of the Jesuits,
Mhm.
that church was the first to have a low rail as opposed to a rood screen in the city of Rome. It was a new construction, but
Okay.
I don't know exactly when the Jesu was constructed, but let's say it was done in the, around the year 1550 or so.
Mhm.
That's not that long ago, you know.
Yeah. Right.
Other things would be pews.
Oh yeah.
I mean, bench seating. Uh, that's actually from Protestantism, as far as I am aware. Older Catholic churches, I mean, even into the 1800s, are open floor plans, right?
Right.
Um, let's see.
And the Orthodox are still standing for their liturgies. I mean,
Yeah, right.
they just didn't.
So if you go to an Eastern liturgy, let's say you go to a Byzantine Catholic liturgy,
Mhm.
you're going to see a barrier, the iconostasis,
Mhm.
which does not allow you in the congregation to witness the action at the altar. You can't see the altar at all. You can't see what the priest is doing. And in the West, you had a screen called a rood screen, which was later cut down to become an altar rail. Uh, you have in the East no bench seating, everybody just open floor plan. Go back a few hundred years in the West, exact same thing. In
Ah,
the East, everybody's chanting. Um, that's the form of music. Same thing in the West before the development of choral masses and so on. So there was a lot more similarity. And then in the late Middle Ages and certainly around the time of Trent and after Trent, there was a lot of innovation. An open sanctuary is pretty innovative, actually, if you think about it.
Yeah.
In the patristic era, it was open. Then it became closed off. And then post-Trent opened up again because the Council of Trent wanted the faithful to see and understand the liturgical action in the sanctuary, not be cut off from it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
Now,
a big switch-o.
Yeah, so you and I are used to open sanctuaries, right?
Yeah.
I mean, whether you're talking the older form of the Roman Rite or the revised form, we're used to being able to see what's going on. That's only a few hundred years development, actually.
Wow, that so puts in perspective all the like controversy about which side of the altar is the priest on to celebrate Mass, because it's kind of like that's actually a little thing compared to having an open sanctuary or a closed one.
Right. And as a Westerner, I expect to be able to see what's taking place. Let's say that go back and I'm a layman. If I went to an Eastern liturgy and the priest went, through the doors behind the iconostasis for the anaphora, I think I would be like, well, now what am I supposed to do?
Is this intermission?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, no.
Because I don't even know what's going on back there, and in the West, we're used to having that engagement and at least visual participation, visual cues from the priest, what he's doing at this time, and so on.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. I mean, just keeping in perspective, too, that we're only one rite of, is there 23 rites in the church?
I believe there are 23,
23. Yeah. And so the rest are all Eastern, and they're all like quite different from the Roman liturgy. And so when we're in this little bubble and we're talking about, the Roman Rite consists of the most people in the world, but it's like it's only one expression of the Eucharistic liturgy in the world that's approved by the church. And it's so different from all these other ones. So how nitpicky should you get? Yes, do things by the rubrics, take care with things and be reverent. But it's like God is expressing his, how he wants to be worshipped in many ways. He's not limiting it.
The essentials being the same, but there being diversity in the accidental expressions. Yeah. By accidental, I mean in the sense of the technical sense of accident, not the essence. And so some of my best friends are Maronite Rite Catholics. So they are they're Arabs, and their priest prays the Eucharistic prayer of their rite in Aramaic, which is the language that Jesus spoke.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's interesting. Diversity in mode of reception of communion, in the prescribed prayers, in the different traditions, in the form of vesture, arrangement of the church and sanctuary, etc. Those things are not essentials. They can change, and that diversity is, I find it fascinating and beautiful. I do believe that we would say that some of the 23 rites are Western, though, besides the Roman Rite. And I think, for example, of the Carthusian liturgy or the Ambrosian liturgy from Milan, as a for example.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
But the Roman liturgy is super dominant. I believe that 98% of Catholics are Roman Rite Catholics.
Yeah.
I believe, yeah.
That sounds about right from what I've heard too. Yeah. I mean, so obviously it's a big deal. And what's cool about the Roman Rite, I mean, among other things, is you can celebrate it anywhere because it's so simple. And so it's not like you gotta, we can't do Mass without all the bells and whistles. I mean, I've been to a Divine Liturgy a couple of times and I thought, wow, can you imagine them doing this every day for daily Mass? I mean, do they do that somewhere? Probably, maybe in big cities or something. But I was like, it's just like you go to Mass and it's at least 2 hours long because it just takes that long.
It's an enormous production. I recently had a conversation with a friend of mine who is a Byzantine Rite priest, and he's made that point that liturgy, let's say the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, from the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, the cathedral there. It's a cathedral liturgy. it's not necessarily well suited to a little parish church, right? And it's also not well suited to offering daily or offering on the battlefield or an awful lot of things. You can have a Roman Rite Eucharistic liturgy that is very elaborate. You know, you could have 4 polyphonic choirs chanting in stereo and incense and 20 acolytes and deacons and, you know, all the bells and whistles. Or you can give me a Jeep and its hood and a kit, and I can celebrate and give Jesus to people before the shots start firing. And that's what Catholic priests did in the Second World War in Korea, right?
Right.
You know, can't
right.
So
Can't really be
I love the Roman Rite for its allowances, for simplicity, or you know, greater ostentation. I like it for the fact that it is essentially the same as Saint Justin recorded it being in about the year 150 AD. The liturgy, the Eucharistic liturgy of the city of Rome, is the first to be recorded, and that was by Justin Martyr. So if you're looking, you know, you say, I want a liturgy that is probably closest to how it shook out 100-ish years after the apostles, but before the influence of the imperial courts, after it was made legal and then the official religion of the empire and so on. What did it look like? Justin Martyr is probably a pretty good description, and that's the Roman Rite. And some elements, you know, had been excluded. Non-essential elements had been excluded from the Roman Rite, but were reincorporated after the Second Vatican Council.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it was a rich liturgy anyway, or, you know, it could be when it was available in circumstances, but it's like we were actually missing things that had fallen out of use, and now we have them restored. So there's more. One thing my mom will say that I just love it. She just looks at, you know, all the liturgies and everything there is in the Catholic Church for this whole diversity of people and rites, and she's like, it's all mine. Like, it's so great. It's not like, well, I'm Roman Rite, so I don't care about all that other stuff. Or, well, I only like this one thing, or I think this thing is the best, so we should just have that. It's like, no, it's just more. It's abundance. It's not, you know, it's not like we have to grade everything. That's not.
And one thing that we haven't mentioned, but I think is important too, because we have talked about this great diversity of elements like music, vestments, sanctuary appointments, and so on. And we've used the term tradition and traditional, but what this all, you know, harkens to is, well, what is traditional? And that's the answer is that which the church judges, the magisterium judges to be appropriate. So, is a rood screen traditional? Absolutely, in one definition of traditional. But the magisterium has said that's behind us. We don't want to do rood screens anymore. We want people to see. Okay, or there was a time in which the precious blood was not distributed to the faithful commonly, and the magisterium made that judgment, and now she has changed and said it may be distributed to the faithful. So which is better or more traditional? The answer is that which for our time the magisterium judges to be most appropriate. You know, so if the church in our time says the vernacular languages may be employed in the Eucharistic liturgy, then for somebody to say that's wrong or not traditional enough is a violation of the Catholic principle that's the magisterium's call. That's the Bishop of Rome's call, not mine.
Right. Right. It's not, I mean, that's why the church is a mother. She's always looking out for us and making those judgments for us. And
Yeah.
it's not, I mean, the church is a family, but it's not exactly the same as like you're this kid, and then you're an adolescent, and then you spiritually graduate, and then you're like, now I'm on a par with the church because I'm a spiritual adult and I can
Right.
make my own decisions. And I don't have to, like, I can question everything she does. Like, I mean, obviously you always have to respect your parents, but there does come a time when there's sort of a shift and you're like, well, you kind of have to make decisions on your own and judgments on your own, but that doesn't happen in the church.
Exactly. Yeah. You don't need your dad to make judgments for you anymore. And unfortunately, I think a lot of Catholics are like, um, I don't need the Pope to make judgments for me anymore or give me guidance. And in fact, he's wrong. And that's not very Catholic.
Yeah. Okay, so what then do you tell people who ask if you would ever choose to offer Mass according to the 1962 Missal?
Well, I have had people ask me to celebrate Mass according to the 62 Missal. And I said I would not do that because it is harder for me to try to get a parish to the ideal of the church, like a parish of people who are not familiar with Latin or haven't been chanting or don't know anything about Ad Orientem, uh, and so on. It is more work to get everybody to a point closest to the ideal of the church, according to her documents and so on, than it is to satisfy a group of traditionalists with their own liturgy, which actually, according to the mind of the church, is less appropriate and inferior to the ideal of the church.
Yeah.
So that was my response. Now, our bishop, as you know, has said that he does not want the 1962 liturgy celebrated in our diocese. So, as far as I'm aware, it's not. Am I? Yeah. Okay.
No, it's Latin Novus Ordos in the parishes where that was happening. He permitted Latin Novus Ordos with Ad Orientem, and at least in our parish, we got a communion rail and different things that he permitted for that, just to keep that going, like, what they were striving for. Basically, it's like recognizing the spirit of it, like, we're going to give you as many bells and whistles as we possibly can because you guys really care about this. We're not going to take it away. So I felt like actually what he was giving us was really it was really a gift, even though it was a hard adjustment for the traditionalist kind of contingent of the parish. Some of them had an easier time than others, but it definitely has pulled us all closer together as a parish. I mean, there's been a lot more interaction, intercommunication, and like my choir at the Novus Ordo Mass had to help the 1962 Mass choir learn to navigate the Novus Ordo because a lot of them had been raised with raised in the SSPX or different places like that. They didn't know how to, liturgically serve a Novus Ordo. And so we did like all the Holy Week liturgies. We just combined choirs. We did them all together and they had a great time. They were so excited, and sitting down, going through all that stuff, they were like, okay, but I was able to explain everything, like why this is different. And they were like, wow, nobody ever explained this to us before. Like, we were just raised with it and this is how it was, but they didn't tell us why it was done like that and not a different way. But you can tell us why it's done. And so they were really happy about that. And they have said over and over to me how much more enriching their experience of the Masses. They're really enjoying doing the responsorial psalm instead of the gradual because it's in the vernacular and it's so meditative. I mean, we chant them. They're very, chanty. But yeah, it's like overall, their kids are responding to the Mass better. They're saying, they feel closer to Jesus than they ever have before.
Wow.
And even when we have visiting priests and they do the Novus Ordo in English because they don't usually know how to celebrate it in Latin. So that once in a while they even get that exposure and they mostly are okay with it. They're like, actually, there's things about that I like, having more English than more Latin. And so they're just kind of growing into the unity element that, I mean, that just wouldn't have happened before. We would have kept.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. That's I'm a bit surprised by it, but I'm very encouraged by it too. It is. I think that the differences between the, let's say, preconciliar Mass and the postconciliar Mass are often exaggerated.
Yeah.
The differences are, I mean, in the grand scheme of liturgy, they're quite minor. Arguably, the biggest difference are the offertory prayers.
Yeah.
But I mean, the canon, the anaphora, the Roman canon is essentially the same. The words of consecration are essentially the same. Many people don't realize that, for example,
Hmm.
uh, that there was a phrase inserted into the words of institution uh, in the, I think it was the Middle Ages. They were in the 1962 Missal. So,
Hmm.
um, the words, the mystery of faith.
Yeah.
Did
Right.
you did you know that those got into the words of consecration in the
Oh,
1962
I don't
Missal?
think I realized that they did that.
Right, and of course,
Mhm.
since the words were usually spoken inaudibly, you'd have to be reading the Missal in Latin to
Yeah.
notice that. But Jesus never said the mystery of faith as recorded in the upper room, right? And so I cannot tell you precisely when and where those words got inserted, but in 1962 Missal, you'll see those there, and then they were extracted back out. So it's just the words of Christ from the Last Supper. Now those are, but
Right.
there's a little, for example. How
Oh,
did I
yeah.
get off on that? I don't know, but
That's good.
uh, if you take if oh yes, if you took the TLM, let's just use that, the TLM, and you put it side by side with the Novus Ordo, sorry, but for lack of better terms, and you celebrate them both in a most traditional and most precise manner, they would look virtually the same.
Yeah.
The priest ad orientem, the priest in beautiful vestments,
Right.
the priest praying in Latin, um, and probably chanting.
Yeah.
Little things missing, like here you'd have an altar boy lifting up the uh, the
Yeah.
base of the.
That's cool.
Here you wouldn't, and things like that. But substantially the same. The problem is just that you can so very rarely find a parish in which the Novus Ordo is offered that way,
Yeah. Right.
right? So
Right. It should be the norm, but it's actually more the exception. But also, it's like it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody else is abusing the liturgy. It's like they're taking advantage of the different options according to their circumstances or their knowledge.
yeah, or
So,
they're limited.
yeah.
They just
Right.
might be limited. Um, you know, uh, the problem, as I see it, is that the the magisterium, meaning firstly popes, but also bishops in communion with him, and then their priests,
Mhm.
uh, as a whole, for many decades now, have not offered a secure norm for the celebration of the Roman Rite, right?
Mhm.
And the advantage of the TLM, the extraordinary form, is that it's ossified, it's frozen. There's it's more or
Yeah.
less the same everywhere, so you know what you're going to get, and then you have this great diversity of mediocrity, usually with the Novus Ordo from place to place,
Yeah.
right? But then that has to be balanced by this fact that the people who attend TLM liturgies do so voluntarily because they like it and because they have energy and interest in investing in it,
Mhm.
which makes TLM liturgies, as I say, artificially excellent.
Oh, wow.
Okay, so why are they the same everywhere? Because there there are very few options in the celebration of that form of the rite. But also, why do they tend to be in beautiful churches? Because the people who want it make sure they're in a beautiful church. You know,
Yeah. Right.
why is there absolute precision and excellence in the celebration? Because it's a huge priority for that priest who does it and the people who assist him.
Right.
But if that becomes universalized and all of us mediocre guys then would be offering that. Let's say you just go back to 1962, there was broad dissatisfaction on the part of the lay faithful for the way that the Mass was commonly celebrated, let's say in the 1950s. And we know this because of theological journals and just even popular Catholic magazines. If you want to read them, from the 50s, you'll find discussion about the vernaculars being allowed. Again, Vatican II didn't happen out of a vacuum. These things were being talked about. And overwhelmingly, people wanted to have the Mass in English.
Right.
Overwhelmingly. I don't know this for a fact, but I would guess they probably also would have liked to have used instruments other than just the organ in liturgy. That was eventually allowed. Wasn't implemented well or anything like that. But, most Roman Rite liturgies right before the council were rushed, were silent, were aesthetically very impoverished, and in many cases were not offered in beautiful churches. There's plenty of ugly churches from the 1950s. I have a little card that I found one time cleaning out a church in which the pastor mandates that the Sunday masses take no less than 40 and no more than 45 minutes. Yeah.
Whoa.
These are his instructions to his vicars. Why? Because they have mass stacked on top of mass, more or less on the hour, and it's just like they're just trying to get everybody through.
Wow.
And so would you have had chant at that mass? There's no time. It just would have been, you show up, Father goes into the sanctuary, does everything in silence as quickly as he can, distributes communion, and then we get these people moving out before the next parking lot of people starts coming in.
Yeah, right.
Not exactly liturgical richness,
Yeah, definitely functionality and efficiency. Also, one time I've heard you speak on even the terms that used to be used for saying Mass, like reading the Mass, saying the Mass. That's how it was commonly described when, pre-Vatican II, talking about the Mass. Now, when you hear priests talking about it, at least in Novus Ordo circles, it's celebrating the Mass. And it's like, okay, wait a second. Okay, so if the ideal was singing and all this stuff, that wasn't happening. So that's why we're, commonly just saying the Mass. And then now
and we say that we use that expression with many things. Let's say a rosary.
Yeah.
Let's say grace, because in Roman Catholicism we have ritual, formal, vocal prayers. Now, here's an interesting little note about that. So what you're alluding to is my point about, saying something as opposed to praying it. Just because I'm saying it doesn't mean I'm even thinking about what I'm saying. We've all done that. You say an Our Father and you get done and you realize I didn't even think about a single concept there. I just said it. And so the point of the church in active participation, conscientious participation, is mean what you are saying, pray it, think it, being engaged. But I read recently that Pope Pius X, early 20th century Pope, he wanted people to begin vocalizing the prayers and not just praying them interiorly, because everything was focused on the, if I'm a congregant, I'm following along in my missal that I brought, and I'm praying interiorly, but I'm not saying anything. And he's saying, say your prayers, don't just pray your prayers. So he's making a different emphasis back then. Yeah.
So. But just according to the time when it's needed.
Right.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
So cool.
Yeah.
Well, it's great that it doesn't all depend on us, that we can trust the church to give us what we need when we need it, even if she's a little slow moving.
Yeah. And well, at least we should trust the church. I don't know that everybody does right now, but I do anyway. I really do. I really do trust the Holy Spirit's providential guidance of the church in every age, including my own chaotic age. Yeah.
Right. There's always been crisis in the church. It's like to be a Catholic is to be in crisis. It's it's now, this is our crisis, this is our reality, whatever's going on, it seems so crazy. But if you look again at a historical perspective and see all the things that happened, the Great Western Schism and the Arian heresy and these kind of things,
Oh,
the
yeah.
Reformation, it was like insane. I mean, what would you think? And they didn't
How
have.
about Protestantism?
Oh, yeah. And you
I
couldn't
mean,
jump online and go read documents for yourself. I mean, you were
oh,
just kind of like, well, whatever they tell me is what I kind of have to go with.
yeah. If you were a Catholic in the early 1500s, you'd think that the church was going out of business because England gone, uh, uh, France infected with heresy, uh, Switzerland gone, Geneva gone,
Germany was so
yeah,
divided. Oh,
yeah, and
yeah.
wars and popes not responding, the Muslims then taking advantage, coming in to conquer Europe.
Oh, no.
You'd say, you want to talk about a crisis? Here's a crisis.
Yeah.
And yet what was just around the corner, basically the tightening up of things and an explosion of fruitfulness, really, within the church,
Right.
and the conversion of continents, so
Right. No, awesome. Okay, so then, I mean, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I do want you to get a little more into many traditionalists seem to think that Vatican II came out of the blue, broke the mold, contradicted previous church teaching even. Is any of that true?
I'll take a sip of water there for dramatic
Before
effect.
you dive into that one. Oh.
Is any of that true? Well,
Was it different from every other church council in history? Was it just like so erratically, I mean, did it just pop up because it was 1960, or was it in the works, like a continuation of Vatican I? I mean, their names are even joined.
It really wasn't in the works. It's different foci were in the works, if you will, through papal encyclicals and different embassies and so on. As far as the liturgy goes, this liturgical movement, as I said, had been long-standing, many, many decades old. That didn't come out of a vacuum. There was great pent-up expectation in the post-World War II period that liturgical reform would be executed, but how? Nobody knew that Pope John was going to call a council, and nobody knew that this council's first priority would be the reform of the liturgy, because up to that point, the way that things had been changing liturgically was mostly by papal or Vatican mandate. Yeah. Okay, so now you had all the bishops together, not just the Pope, making a mandate, and they are together and they form a constitution on the sacred liturgy in which they lay out principles for the reform. It's a constitution, and then the work of the reform would be handed over to basically a group of committees. Okay, they were called the concilium. Okay. And so the bishops of the church, under the headship of the Pope at an ecumenical council guided by the Holy Spirit, say, here are the principles, now execute this reform. So one of the principles that I mentioned was that there would be greater participation, active, conscious participation on the part of all the faithful. Okay, but there were many other things. Language, it said the vernacular languages may be used, but the Latin was to be retained. It said that Holy Communion under both species may be offered to the faithful under limited circumstances. Okay, etc. So here's some general principles. Then the execution comes a little bit later. I think that the argument that that was a modernist or quasi-Protestant, ideologically unfaithful work may be countered by pointing out that the votes of the bishops were, the number 2,000, it was like 2,100 bishops in favor voted yes, and 4 bishops voted no.
Yeah, I remember it was 4 against and every other
Yeah.
bishop there.
Yeah.
And it's
I
the
mean,
largest representation of worldwide Catholicism
yeah.
ever at a council. It was
Yeah. I
like, I
mean,
think it was like 3 times the size of Vatican I. I mean,
oh,
ginormous.
enormous.
So it's like they've never even
Absolutely.
been able to all get together like that before. It's like that was an accurate representation
Yeah.
for the first time.
So, the document Sacrosanctum Concilium, they weren't handed that and forced to vote on it at gunpoint. And we're going like, whoa, what kind of a weird wacko leftist thing is this?
Oh, yeah.
No, they were familiar with these concepts from the whole 20th century liturgical movement. They're
Mhm.
familiar with these principles. They put them into a document. And I mean, you want to talk about unanimity. Wow.
Yeah.
I think that's over 99% agreement. And so that cuts across, I mean, ideological, linguistic, cultural, national divides. That's amazing. That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And that's different than what resulted, but that also doesn't mean that they're completely divorced either. What the work of the committees did in giving us the present missal, only slightly revised since 1970, 69, 70. There were bishops who voted for Sacrosanctum Concilium, and then they said, well, this isn't what I had in mind. This is false. But it's not their place. They did their job. Now go home and let the Pope take it from here, which is exactly what he did.
Awesome. Okay. Well, because one of the things I do know a little bit about is that one of the big issues with Vatican II is that how they covered ecclesiology. And that was actually something that was on the roster to be discussed and sort of pronounced on at Vatican I. But because the war happened and interrupted it, they basically did not get through everything they were going to. So that was just picking up where the last council left off. It was totally planned, to be treated. It just hadn't been done yet. So that was the novelty per
The
se.
First Vatican Council, as you say, ended early because Garibaldi showed up and said, "I'll give you 48 hours to get out of town."
Yeah,
And so then it's like, oh, I guess the council's over.
Oh my God.
In any case, that's a simplification, but you get the point,
Right.
So it's 1962 and it's the jet age and people can safely and quickly fly from wherever they want in the world, to Rome and be together. And there's not a war going on, and we can spend a few years discussing very important matters. But their first priority was liturgy. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that is really significant. And that also tells you that it's like the bishops they listen to the people, they know what's going on. And so they're coming from all over going, well, this definitely needs some attention. And everybody's like, oh, the mass was fine. We don't need to, when traditionalists talk like that, you're like, well, you're blowing off like the whole church. I mean,
not only that, but if everything was fine, then why in the world would virtually every bishop say, let's change it? When things are fine, you leave well enough alone. I mean, there weren't even 25% of bishops going, I don't understand what this is.
Yeah, right.
I think it's fine, and no offense, but I vote no.
Yeah.
No, I mean,
that would definitely seem more human too, to have much more of a split,
right.
Opinions on the matter. And I mean, I'm sure it took, time to kind of hammer out, but it's like the Holy Spirit guides the church, and those bishops were listening to him. I mean, it's like otherwise, how could you explain that kind of unanimity?
It's extraordinary. Again, you would even think that there would be more that might just say, I agree with this idea of reform in principle. I'm not against the scholarship behind it or anything like that. I just don't think now is the time. I think this is imprudent, and I'm going to vote no. You didn't even have that.
Right.
It's quite remarkable. So, if I may say so, to people who would consider themselves to be traditionalists, and I use that as opposed to traditional. Everybody should be traditional, but traditionalist means desiring to go back to that which existed before the council. I would say the votes for Sacrosanctum Concilium demonstrate almost universal dissatisfaction with the status quo, and you want to go back to the status quo. Well, if all of those people who lived it day in and day out for decades and knew nothing else were almost 100% dissatisfied with it, maybe there's something there to consider.
Yeah, good point. So what real, kind of briefly, do you want to touch on some of the ways the reform of the liturgy specifically brought back neglected traditions to the celebration of the rite that had happened in early apostolic times but fallen out of use, like the general intercessions and the
Sure.
trying to think of those things.
Well, some things that not only the council but the whole liturgical movement as a whole brought back. The first would be chant. Okay, so chant is, I think it's fair to say, universal amongst all the Eucharistic liturgies of the Church, and the norm in the East, but had faded out of use in the West, and then in the early 20th century was brought back. Okay, so pretty recent development, but completely authentic restoration of tradition. Another would be the congregational participation in the prayers. As we discussed, they having been given to the altar server. And so the people of the congregation were not vocalizing or chanting back their responses. Now, beginning in the early 20th century, is confirmed by the Second Vatican Council. We should be doing that. That's mostly what they meant by active participation. The use of vernacular languages, that used to be the case. Latin was introduced because it was the vernacular. Then it wasn't anymore, so now we can have vernacular. We don't have to all the time. We can still offer the Mass in Latin, as I do. But that was a reintroduction of a tradition. I would point out more scripture. I think that the revised lectionary is absolutely magnificent. Absolutely magnificent in its parallelism between Old and New Testaments. Fantastic. I would point out the offertory, the option of having the people bring up the bread and the wine. Now that had been displaced, but it was part of the ancient tradition, so it's an option again now. You can have it or you cannot have it. That's nice. The kiss of peace. Kiss of peace. Some simplifications, I would say. For example, with vestments, with signs, with different prayers, there were a lot of repetitions that had crept in to the Roman Rite in the Middle Ages, and they were then codified in the Missal after Trent. I couldn't tell you how many signs of the cross were made by the priest over the elements, but it was in the 20s, I do believe. So that was simplified. It's not as if if 3 is good, 30 is better. Sometimes it's worse. So just sort of a noble simplicity as a principle of the Roman Rite was applied to the prayers and the structure of the Mass. It's a lot simpler to offer. It's less cumbersome. Now, in fact, the duplications are mentioned, alluded to in Sacrosanctum Concilium. And I've studied this a bit, and it seems that because in the West we have always had such an emphasis upon validity and a legalism, if you will. Western legalism is applied to theology and liturgy. I mean, we try to be very, very precise, right? In the West, we're not amorphous in general, and no, we try to be really, really tight. Well, when in the late Middle Ages you had handwritten copies of missals right before the printing press, and lack of uniformity, there would sometimes be confusion. Do I need to say this once in order for this to be valid, or do I need to say it 3 times? I'm just making this up. And so what would happen is it would become the custom to do it in a multiplication of times to make sure that it was valid. And so, for example, the Kyrie, we're familiar with the 3 times. It was 9 times in the older form of the Rite, just as for example. 2 Gospels, 2 Glorias, 9 Kyries, 23 signs of the cross, and so on.
Right.
Just unnecessary. And so it's simplified.
Well, when you read the account from Justin Martyr, from 150 or whatever, and of Mass, I have read it, but it was a while ago. But I remember reading it, being like, "Wow, this is the Novus Ordo." It doesn't perfectly line up with the TLM, but it does better with the Novus Ordo. It's like that's exactly what he's describing.
It lines up more with the Novus Ordo. You are correct, but I do want to emphasize that the 2 forms of the Rite are essentially the same. When people get bent out of shape about this or that, we're talking about tiny, tiny differences in the grand scheme of things, right?
Yeah, right. There's the story I just heard recently, because someone that goes to the earlier Mass, the Latin Novus Ordo at our church, they moved here right after the bishop had it changed to the Latin Novus Ordo from the TLM. And so they've been going ever since. They've been going to it for like 10 months. And anyway, then they were talking to some friends, and they were like, and the friends asked, well, is it actually the TLM, like the 1962, or is it the new missal? And he was like, I actually don't know. I mean, I think it's the TLM, but I was like, oh, well, see there. I mean,
good.
It was like, okay. I mean, he's had experience with the traditional Latin Mass before, but coming to this, it was like so similar because of all the, the way the postures and everything were. It's like he's not sitting there scrutinizing it; he's just attending and praying it, and it's doing the job. I mean,
that's neat, and that's how it should be. I don't think anybody could argue with the statement that the implementation of the revised missal was a complete disaster. The abuses, the disobedience, it was just horrible. And you could hardly have picked a worse era than to implement a massive change than right after the Cultural Revolution that swept the Western world in the late 60s.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it was rough. And then you get all those people saying, well, because of Vatican II, all this stuff happened, or, why did the seminaries empty and all this stuff? It's interesting because I was just talking to someone the other day who was explaining, I know this is a little rabbit trail, sorry, but I just thought this was so interesting. I wanted to share it because they were saying that, it was a Benedictine priest from a monastery they were talking to. And they said, why did this happen? In the seminaries, all these religious vocations just went poof. And he's like, because those people who left never had a vocation in the first place. He's like, you have to understand Catholic culture and these huge families, okay? And they're not rich, most of them. He's like, they have so many beds, so many rooms. They're having, number 10, number 13, and they say to 16-year-old daughter, like his sister, this was him growing up, they said, honey, we need your bed for the next baby. And you're old enough, it's time to go to the convent down the street. Just enter with the sisters and be a nun. So she did, and she ended up staying. But he had an older brother who they did the same thing to. They packed him off to seminary because they're like, well, we need a priest in the family, and we need you out. And so go to seminary. So he did, and he became a priest. He left later. He's like, there were so many, you were expected to do it, so you did it. But it wasn't necessarily because you had a vocation. So you're kind of in there and you're, in the works, whatever. And then all this tumult happens and whatever other cultural influences and church changes, whether you like them or not, you might just be like, I don't belong. This is not what I thought.
Something was not right.
Yeah.
If you have a system that can collapse in more or less about 7 years' time, something's wrong with the system.
Yeah.
And I wasn't alive then, to say precisely what it was. I've heard anecdotal things such as that which you just mentioned. Another one that I've heard is in our diocese, there were an awful lot of priests from Butte and Anaconda.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Right.
Now, those were very poor, but ethnically Catholic towns.
Yeah.
Well, so, you can stay in town and be a minor and poor, or you can be a priest and get a free college education, which nobody's ever had in your family, and have everything provided for you for the rest of your life and be respected and kind of the pride and joy of the family, and get out of Butte. No offense to our Butte listeners, but
no, I love Butte. So yeah,
yeah. So do I. So do you think that there might have been some guys who shouldn't have gone to seminary but did to escape their lot in life?
Yeah, they're likely death in the mines. I mean, it was really bad. So
and you know, I won't name names, but you know, I've known priests who I thought, yeah, you probably shouldn't have been a priest. You know,
yeah. I mean, God, he uses people anyway, but it's like, as far as a genuine call, like this is what God had always ordained for you, or this is something you just sort of made fit. It's like,
all was not well in the post-war Catholic Church. Sad to say, it was apparently not as good as it seemed, and even one might argue as much as Pope John the 23rd judged it to be. There was an instability below the surface, and that had consequences.
Right. I mean, even think of the influx of television into everyone's homes in the 50s, later 50s and 60s. It's like that wasn't, people talk about the good old 50s like they were so golden, but you watch movies and TV shows made at that time, you're like, that's really kind of raunchy. Like they were really going out on a limb with this entertainment. And then it's like your family, your developing children from their earliest ages are now exposed to these things. They're being raised with them on a daily basis, hours of this stuff. And there's definitely not enough religious education to counteract that. I mean, it's like, well, no wonder. I mean, and then they're in seminaries, TV's in rectories, TV's in convents. It's like, it was very common. And it's like, I think it's easy to underestimate. And Pius XII had some really interesting words about, kind of like the danger of theater and television and what, how, horribly, damaging to the morals of society that could be if it ever became something that every family had unlimited access to.
Yeah, and of course, that's just the American context. Like people in Europe, they're still recovering from the fact that we leveled their whole country with bombs. So, and then Latin America is dealing with, a growing tension between a movement to communism and then a far right reactionary governments. Things were not far from ideal.
Right. Oh gosh. Well, we can segue into kind of the next section, which is about traditionalism today. And the first question I had, you kind of already addressed about why people's experience of the old rite of Mass is so different today than would have been the run-of-the-mill pre-council, because you explain the artificial excellence and like people are drawn to that, so they go and then they pool their gifts and they're all enthused about it, and it's like we're here because this is so important, this is what we're doing, we're going to do it the ultimate best. And so people stumble on that and then they're like, oh well, this is it, this is how it always was, and that's not true. So that
yes, I think you summed it up well. You will not likely find a TLM offered in an ugly environment, will you?
No,
because it's self-selective. Right, exactly. But so the analysis has to be to the essence, the form of the rite itself, not necessarily its manifestation. And this can be applied then on the flip side, because let's say somebody wants to criticize a Novus Ordo and they go to this parish and it's really goofy. They go, see, you go, wait, that is not being offered correctly. I let me show it to you correctly. It's going to be very, very different, right? So you have perhaps an artificially excellent TLM and an unfortunately incorrect, unexcellent Novus Ordo, but they are both somewhat out of balance, if you will.
Right. Right. Oh, that's a good point. Okay. So you did mention the difference between being a traditional Catholic, which all of us should be, and traditionalists, which is kind of, it's this word that's describing a movement and an ideology that's sort of, it's like, if we go back, things will be better. Things were fine past a certain point, but after that, they've been sketchy. And it's like, So which should we strive to be? You said.
Well, I don't see how you could be a Catholic and not be traditional. So I am happy to say I am a traditional Catholic, and in fact, I want to be as traditional as possible, as authentically traditional as possible. But the term traditionalist, as in rad trad traditionalist Catholic, I don't care to have association with that movement, which is really more of an ideological or a philosophical movement than a liturgical one. Liturgy is, if you will, the battleground and the focus of it, but that's really not the essence of it. Are you familiar with Michael Lofton? Yeah, so I've just recently stumbled upon him. Seems to me just an outstanding lay Catholic theologian, and he made this point as regards traditionalism. That which is in the root will eventually make its way to the branches. And he put into words something that had occurred to me back in 2007 when Pope Benedict gave the motu proprio that allowed widespread use of the older forms of the sacraments, which was an enormous concession to the schismatic groups that he wanted to bring back into communion with the church.
Yeah.
Okay, right? And I thought that, and I think that was very naive, because it's really not about liturgy. It's really about authority. And have any of these groups come back into communion with the church? No, actually, it's gotten worse. And we gave them everything they wanted. But then what has crept into the Catholic Church are the philosophical and theological and ideological errors of that movement. So we never, ever would have imagined, if we went back to 2006, would you imagine that there's going to be tons and tons of young Catholics militantly opposing the Pope? What? No, Catholics don't do that. Loyalty to the Pope is that which defines Catholicism. That sounds like Protestantism, right?
Yeah.
Would you think that people are going to be questioning the validity of an ecumenical council? All of these different things that went into the schismatic groups, and I'm thinking there especially of Lefebvre.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, he is the father of traditionalism. I mean, his ideologies percolate into everybody's, even if they're in the church, but they think along those lines. It came from him, basically.
Yeah. And so it's really a prideful rejection of magisterial authority. I mean, in a nutshell. And here its most popular manifestation is liturgy. But in other centuries, in other contexts, it's been soteriology. It's been morality. But what does it boil down to? The magisterium of the Catholic Church makes a definitive pronouncement or gives a definitive guidance. Do you accept it or do you reject it? Yes or no? Take your pick. And that's where the rubber meets the road,
Well, I mean, it's been explained, like in 2012 when they were really dealing a lot with the Society of St. Pius X, trying to negotiate their reunion. And then I think in 2019, again, they released some terms to them that were like, these are what you need to consent to in order to be considered in communion with the church. And they specifically stated that it was doctrinal. The issues under discussion that were keeping them separated were doctrines. It wasn't, and their issues with not accepting Vatican II. And basically, they don't even accept Pastor Aeternus from Vatican I because they don't accept the supremacy of the Pope. And
because they don't accept authority.
Right. Yeah.
And when you reject magisterial authority, you will eventually, whether you are Lefebvre or Luther, or you will reach logical absurdities, such as the church has entered a great apostasy, and there's just a little remnant now, and there's no pope. That's fairly absurd. Just as absurd as before the printing press, there, it was just terrible, almost complete corruption of the church. And now that we have the printing press and Martin Luther, finally, everybody can know God accurately.
Yeah.
Absurd, you know. I
Right.
see this movement just getting just wilder and wilder. And to be honest with you, um, I think that the patience of a lot of pastors is being exhausted
Yeah, I was
by
just going to ask you,
by
about
these
your
people.
experiences. Like, what has been your experience interacting with and ministering to traditionalists in your parishes over the years? Because I know you've had some in and out.
Mhm.
Like, what is that like for you as a priest?
Unfortunately, mostly negative. And not just, I'm going to broaden not just my experience, but also the experience of other priests whom I know,
Yeah.
and to cast the net even wider beyond our diocese, because wouldn't want, I'm a specific person. I wouldn't want somebody to think, oh, he must be thinking of that parishioner or family, or he's
Yeah.
referring to that priest or whatever. So I'm going to be really broad. I have priest friends all over the place, bishop friends, and the stridency, often the pridefulness, the selfishness, the dismissiveness of any considerations other than what a person's preferences are. Uh, it's so common that I used to be very naive and think, oh, well, if I would just provide the things that are desired by sort of this stripe of the Catholic faithful, namely, they want reverence, they want certain liturgical elements. So give them a reverent mass and give them ad orientem and chant and some Latin, and that they'll be satisfied. No,
Oh,
one priest put it this way: there's no satisfying these people. That's what he said. You can bend over backwards, make sacrifices, do things, fight battles maybe behind the scenes to do things. And then in the end, the moment that something better is available 32 miles away, they're gone.
wow.
They'll drop their parish, their priest, their bishop, even, like a bad habit, because their their main priority is what I want.
Wow.
Yeah, and priests and bishops, I think, have just, I mean, I have felt used and manipulated,
Yeah.
let's say, to be brought over to somebody's house and wined and dined. And the whole point is to get me to offer the worship of Almighty God according to the way that these people want. And I would say, I don't operate like that. And
Mm.
then and then they're just gone. It's like, oh
Oh,
well, so what was that all about? I was just being used, you
yeah.
know. Uh,
Right.
um,
Well, the ends justify the means, I guess. If you're,
yeah,
if that stripe.
yeah.
Yeah.
And Pope John Paul II, he made a very insightful point that the opposite of love is not hate; it's use. When
Yeah.
you use a person, you make that person the means to an end rather than loving them as an end in themselves. And I think that pastors in the church right now have felt very exhausted and burned by all of these different ideological, theological, liturgical tensions.
Yeah.
And the old liberals, they're dying off. They're going away. They're not. They didn't reproduce to begin with, and they're very old right now. So if
Yeah.
I change something, am I most likely to get grief from an old liberal because I took away their guitar? No, it's most likely going to be because I didn't offer a mass exactly the way that this 24-year-old
Yeah.
Traddy wanted it. Uh, and it's like,
Wow.
uh, it's,
Switch out.
yeah. And also,
Huh.
stepping back from it just a bit, I mean, the last time I checked, I'm a priest and you're not. And last time I checked, God entrusted the liturgy to ministers.
Yeah.
So, if you wanted to run liturgy, maybe you should have gone to seminary.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
that's, I'm sorry, that might sound a little bit edgy, but
Right.
When I was young, I had such respect for the priest. I never ever would have thought of going to the priest and being like, "You're just absolutely wrong, and you need to do what I think is best." I mean, if I'd done that as a young man, my dad would have, given me a
Take
strap, and
you out.
yeah. But
Oh
anyway,
man. Yeah. No,
yeah,
it
it's
is quite that attitude of, yeah, like you said, pridefulness. It's you're really arrogating a lot of authority to yourself. And it's okay to know things. And I mean, I believe the faithful should be educated and that they can even help their pastors to be better educated, but in a way that's like, I want to be here for you and I want to provide you sanctuary, like somewhere you can just be a person, be appreciated and accepted for what you do for our community and who you are as a person. And then, if there's problems, let's try to work them out together
that's
instead
right.
of like, let me tell you what's going on over here. But another thing as a layperson, that this is really good that you're saying this, because I work in liturgy and um, I know what needs to be done. And my pastor right now is very, very much in step with that. But there are times when for various reasons, he feels like he needs to kind of adjust what we're doing. And maybe that's not, I'm like, well, the ideal is here. And maybe what we're doing is like there now because of what you changed. But it's like, if I present that to him and I'm like, you still want to go ahead? And he's like, yeah, I think this is what we need to do. I'm not going to be, if there's any kind of punishment involved in that, or like, less than ideal responsibility, that's not on me. I'm still serving and I'm trying to be helpful and doing what I can to help my priest according to what he's directing. I mean, he's trying to make his best decisions, and I'm sure God gives him grace for that, because it's not easy to always know what to do. And there's a lot of room for, adaptability depending on your circumstances. There's a lot of provisions that can be made. And even if you're, going a little beyond that, you might have to answer for that later. But the laity, it's like, you're not like committing a sin doing what your priest told you to do as far as liturgy goes, because and you've tried, everything you can, to be helpful. It's like, don't go whack them over the head. Even then, I just don't think that's ever appropriate.
I don't think that people adequately appreciate how difficult it is to be a parish priest today.
Yeah.
There are too few of us. Many of us, not myself, but others, continue to labor generously, though they're old or infirm or just tired, and so on. And we're all, doing arguably the work of two priests of prior eras. We have multiple parishes instead of just one, and we have worse awareness of the faith than there used to be. We have so much more to do, and to have people be abusive, disrespectful, dismissive, and so on is really quite defeating, because I know that a lot of priests are. It's really hard. And who are our families? They're our parishioners. We don't have wives to go home to say, man, I had a rough day at work. And, you're a good man. Keep it. Like,
right.
if we're just getting beat up by our own parishioners all the time, that's very, very hard on a man. Very hard on a man. On the other hand, all of us will have our liabilities and our strengths. one guy might be great at chant and stink at I don't know, something else, the liturgy. But, love the man, like support the man. He's given his life to you, so.
Right. Well, then, I mean, this question was going to come later, but I want to ask it now because we're already talking about it. Like, can you?
No, I just have to ask, have we been talking for nearly 2 hours?
We have, and I don't want to keep you forever, but I was just
mackerel.
Like, there's so much coming out that I didn't even expect us to talk about. So
okay, all right.
Everybody's happy in the chat, so you don't have to.
They are? I can't even see the chat. Well, I've got I will have to. My car is broken down. I told my mechanic I would be over there, so we can talk a little bit longer, but not too terribly much longer.
Okay. I was just going to ask, what specific things would you recommend for the laity to do that we might be most helpful in supporting and assisting our priests today?
Well, I would say pastoral or parochial loyalty. So, you remember when you were my parishioner, I made this this distinction or contrast between viewing your parish as a franchise of the Catholic Church, like an Applebee's. It doesn't matter. Any Applebee's, you get the same menu, you get the same stuff. You don't have to have loyalty to this Applebee's or that Applebee's, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's very different than it being a spiritual family, because I have dinner with my family and I don't just blow off my family to have dinner wherever I want, right? So the parish should be seen as a spiritual family, a stable community according to the Code of Canon Law, with a father over it, and the Mass is our sacrificial, worshipful meal.
Right.
Well, if I'm not running like a franchise Applebee's of the Catholic Church where I don't care who the strangers are just as long as the pews are filled. No, I'm the father of a spiritual family. I need to know my people. Where are you? Why aren't you here? Do you have cancer? What's going on with you? Right. Who's missing? And draw more people in. And when people just travel around going wherever they want because of a mass time or liturgical stuff or whatever, that undermines the stability and the connectedness, the communal nature of the parish. It leaves the priest being pretty isolated. It's much better when everybody knows their priest and their priest knows everybody and you're a family, right? So I would say parochial loyalty. Don't forget that priests are human beings. This came out with COVID. People started treating us as if we were politicians. Politicians are human beings too. We should probably be more respectful of politicians. But the abuse that priests took trying to keep communal spaces, namely churches, open in very, very difficult circumstances. Anybody who is a principal of a school or running a small business or a priest running a church can say it was very, very hard to keep a communal space open under the circumstances which you didn't have much control over, right? I noticed that it was then that people started to become very, very disrespectful and abusive of their priests. And not just me, I'm talking to all my priests. And some of them had like crises because their own people were so mean. So,
right.
just, love your priest, like be respectful, like if your priest was just going around ripping everybody's face off, bawling them out, you'd be like, that guy, that's not good. Well, the other way too. So, and then I would say, since we were talking about liturgy, I'd like to recommend some resources. Do you mind if I do that?
Oh, yes, do, please.
Just to educate yourself. So I'd like to recommend 4 books here, because I'll bet that people who are watching are probably interested in liturgy. So the first of these is The Spirit of the Liturgy by Joseph Ratzinger. Outstanding book and timely. Then another book this is the one I was referencing earlier, Denis Crouan's The Liturgy Betrayed, published by Ignatius Press. This dates from, I believe it's 2000.
Okay.
And his thesis is basically this. There was supposed to be a reform, and it didn't actualize, and the church split liturgically into 2 camps, liberals and traditionalists. We still haven't yet actualized what the council wanted. So he was calling for that in this book. That's very simple. You can see it's a small book. It's an easy read. If you want to know the history of the liturgy, then I recommend History of the Liturgy by Marcel Metzger. This, again, it's a small book, very easy to read. It's just all nuts and bolts. What were the various stages? What are the major texts that you can make reference to, and so on. I think actually in a conversation with you, Laura, some time back, I mentioned this book to you.
Yeah, I bought it. I'm not through it yet, which is really sad because it's short.
No.
But I have got a lot out of it. No, I wish they'd hand it out at the parish at Christmas time or something. Usually they do that, like a free book for every family. I'm like, maybe this one, Father, because he's been having some
Yeah, if you don't have time to read 10 books that are all this thick,
Oh,
and you just want somebody to just boil it down for me in simple terms.
yeah.
I've heard, for example, of the, uh, um, well, let's just see if I can, the apostolic times, the first century. What did the Eucharistic liturgy look like? Just spell it out for me in simple terms. All right. Great little book. And then this is popular theology. Of course, Scott Hahn's The Lamb's Supper. He's got plenty of puns in it, and it's written for a general audience. But very, very profoundly impactful if you want to understand the different parts of the liturgy and what it is. I read this as a priest. I'm already the minister of the Eucharist. I read this book, and it helped me to appreciate what the Supper of the Lamb is and means. So thank you, Dr. Hahn, for this wonderful, wonderful little book, The Lamb's Supper. And I would imagine probably this has been read by a number of your viewers, but those are 4, and there's lots of others too.
Awesome.
But for a general population, I would recommend those.
Right. Oh, thank you so much, Father. And I mean, we didn't even get into the section I had on doing the liturgy right, and walking through the Mass with you from all your, experience and research, and
well, have me back.
Oh, I want to have you back.
You want to
I want to do a
talk
part 2.
about what a theoretically ideal Mass would look like?
Yeah, and then I want to talk about what you've done to achieve that in your own parishes, because you have done a lot, and just to give people a picture of what's possible, because there's just a lot of hopeless, wilty Catholics out there that are like, oh, it'll never be what it's supposed to be. It's a failed experiment. Let's just go back, because even people who've given it a try, and they're like, we've waited so long, and why haven't we found this? Why isn't it the way it should be? And so it is possible, and it's
look at that. See, that's a sign behind you.
I'm being fetched. Oh man, no, it's good. Yeah, no, if you'd be willing to come back, I'd love to do a part 2, because
maybe I'd be happy to do that, and we could talk about kind of the practical as opposed to the theoretical, which we've done now. And I could say what I've done in my parishes, and then in theory, according to my study in the church's documents, what should the Mass look like? Not necessarily does it look like here or there, but what should it look like?
And that it's possible. No, I think that would be really great for people. So no, totally. Oh, quick before we close, there is this one comment in the chat I wondered if you wanted to address. I'm just going to pop it up here.
Do people have questions?
I haven't had any actual questions yet, but this one addressed something you said. Oh, wait. I'm sorry. No, this is not the one I thought it was. I'm sorry. I knew it was Declu's Views who put it up. Where was it? I'm sorry. Oh, here it is. Okay. Just for clarity, Summorum Pontificum was not primarily a concession to traditionalist schismatic movements. It was much more deeply rooted in his theology of the liturgy. He says this himself. What would you say to that, Father?
Well, I don't have the text of the document in front of me, and so I will presume that this gentleman is correct and more familiar than I am. I would say that Pope Benedict did hope that the allowance of the older forms of the Rite would contribute to reconciliation with schismatic traditionalist groups. I would doubt that somebody would disagree with that in a general sense. That doesn't mean that in the document, the motu proprio himself, that he's saying, here's my agenda. Okay. But with Benedict, of whom I am a big fan, there was a bit of a problem, in my opinion. And so let me be clear. This is a respectful disagreement with a prudential judgment that he made with a pastoral approach. Okay. He would advocate for one thing in theory, and then as Pope, do or not do something in actuality. So let me give you 2 examples of that. He was more or less the principal driving agent of the reform, as it was termed, correct? Okay, so we need to reform the Roman Rite.
Mhm.
Then he becomes Pope. Does he exercise and impose a strict discipline like everybody thought he would on the Roman Rite, stamping out abuse like, no, he doesn't. But what does he do? He allows the older forms of the rites with almost no restrictions whatsoever.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Why are you not exerting discipline and cleaning up the mess of the
Yeah.
reform? Now
Right.
that you have complete authority as Pope.
Right.
Another example of this. If you read this book, he argues explicitly before he's Pope that the priest facing the people while at the altar was a terrible mistake that has changed the Mass, and we need to go back to the priest and the people facing the same direction, ad orientem as it's termed.
Mhm.
Okay, he is elected Pope. Did he restore ad orientem and get rid of versus populum? No.
I mean, he celebrated Mass
Yes.
both ways, right?
It's,
So
so
right.
yeah, and I love Pope Benedict, big fan, but you can see, like, for somebody who's kind of in the middle between the people and the magisterium, that's kind of maddening. It's kind of
Yeah, right.
maddening.
You're like,
You know?
right.
Yeah,
Right.
you advocate for something, and I'm like, yes, I agree with you,
Yeah.
and then you don't
Right.
do it, or reform the reform, but now let's all of a sudden do the older rites.
Yeah, like the hermeneutics of continuity. I mean, I thought his theology was very much that the old should inform the new. And so allowing the old more widely was sort of supposed to give people more exposure and context to what the Novus Ordo is supposed to be. And that was one of the ways he hoped the reform would be helped. But
Yeah.
what happened is that it kind of created these polarized
It
factions.
created a monster. Yeah.
Yeah, which, I mean, he couldn't have known really that was going to happen. And again, like we talked about earlier, when you're in authority, there's so many things you have to take into consideration, or things you didn't understand until you were in that position, that you can't even explain to people. So maybe that's why he didn't act on all these
Yeah,
things.
and I don't know why he didn't, but he didn't. So
Yeah. All right. Anyway, I just thought that
do
was
we have any other questions from people?
No, I just had a lot of appreciation of you in the chat. Someone who wants to get in touch with you, appreciating your sense of humor, and all these things. So it's very gratifying. Maybe next time.
Sure. So I'm my parish of residence is St. John Vianney in Belgrade, Montana. So the website is sjvbelgrade.org. So you can go there, email, whatever like that if you'd like. Laura, Josh Brigham, is that your cousin?
Yes.
I just had dinner with him and his wife Rachel last night.
Oh yes.
Yeah,
I heard
didn't.
they're coming into the church officially.
Well, yeah, they. It seems that they're on that path, and this wouldn't be the place to like talk about personal things. But I was just, I'm having dinner with a couple. They're in RCIA, but I kind of want to just check in with them, like, where are you both? How are you doing? All this stuff, and then somehow he made the connection that you're his cousin. And I said, well, tomorrow I'm going to be on this. Yeah.
Oh, that was yesterday. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
So that was nice. Anyway.
Oh, small world.
So they're doing well.
Oh, I'm so glad. I'm so grateful.
Such a nice couple. Yeah.
Good. Awesome. Well, we appreciate you so much, Father, coming on and sharing all your knowledge and experience. And we're gonna milk you for some more of it as soon
that's
as
nice. I'm honored by your invitation. I always feel like I know I have something to offer, but I feel there's people who just are so much better qualified than I am. It doesn't get any more obscure than Belgrade and Three Forks, Montana. Who am I? I'm nobody.
Oh.
I mean, see this degree behind me?
Yeah.
That's not even real. It's just a fake degree that I made up to look important on this channel. No, I'm just kidding. That's
I know you better than that. I don't think you'd really do that, but
yeah. No, but but also I believe that, like that's how God works. Like, you do your thing, I do my thing. We throw it out there. It'll stick or it won't, and it'll be a benefit. But at least, hopefully, it'll be of no harm. And so,
Oh,
yeah.
awesome. No, I think it'll be really great. And so we'll have you back and we'll talk about more. And then in the meantime, I'm going to put the link to the podcast you did with Catholic Stuff You Should Know priests down in the description so people can go listen to that, because you got into a bunch of things we didn't get to talk about today. We talked about different things today.
If people aren't familiar, there's this very, very popular podcast, Catholic Stuff You Should Know, which coincidentally was started and run by friends of mine from seminary in the Archdiocese of Denver. So they invited me to do a session with them, and we did it on liturgy. So we spent about 15 minutes
reminiscing,
busting each other's chops, and we had a lot of fun doing it. But if you're not interested in embarrassing stories, then you can just fast forward to about 50-minute mark, and then we kind of get into the serious
15
stuff.
or 20. No, it's good though. It was fun to you guys getting warmed up to it. So, but yeah, there's so much.
They're great guys. So.
Awesome. Well, all right. Thank you so much, Father, and God bless you. And we will hope to see you soon.
It's really nice to see you, Laura. God bless you. I wish you were still down here. I wish you were still in my parish. But all the best to you and AJ and the family. Yeah, and we'll be in touch.
All right. Sounds good, Father.
All right. God bless. See you, everybody.